All right, let's get rolling.
You should say we're watching.
I should.
You want to tell them the site's live.
Been informed of a couple things. One is that our site selection press release has now gone live. It's now out. It's pretty cool. So we also, someone pointed out to me that there's a statistic that I think it's worth honing in on a little bit, that it's not just that the internet response rate itself was high. We also learned in this test that 80% of the people who responded via the internet. That proportion of people using the internet is also really high. In the ACS, it's about 55%. So there are a couple of ways that this test bodes really well for us as we move, really working hard toward our stretch goal of a 55% response rate of the whole population, not of just the responding universe, but that, we really believe that we can push a lot of respondents and a lot of people to the internet. And if we can get that and get there, it's going to have huge dividends for the census, for the quality of the data, but also for the cost, because the internet is so much cheaper to process. So that's all very cool. I'm also watching myself on TV on Lisa's iPad, which is a new experience for me. I look awesome, I think. I'm quite pleased. I should put my glasses back on because it makes me look more dignified. And there's a delay it's pointed out to me too. So at any rate, because my glasses aren't on yet. So at any rate, we have two really, I think, important discussions coming up now. I thought that was a good discussion on 14, and that we now have a discussion of the work we're doing to get to the design decisions and what it is that we actually have to accomplish from here going forward. Deirdre Bishop has put a lot of time into this and done a wonderful thing for us to help us frame this as we go forward. So she'll be walking us through what we're calling now, affectionately, the path document. The document that outlines how we're going to get to the design decisions. And then Tim Traynor is going to lead us through the reengineered address canvassing recommendation that he's been leading the effort to reach. So I'll turn it over now to Deirdre Bishop.
Thank you, Burton. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be with you today and happy to present the path to the 2020 Census Design Decision. I know that you've attended previous PMRs, you've had discussions with Census Bureau staff, and you've heard that the Census Bureau is committed to conducting a 2020 census that costs less per housing unit than 2010, while continuing to maintain high quality. Early on, we recognized that in order to do this, we'd have to identify our major cost drivers, and we'd have to identify new ways to enumerate our population. Over the past few years, we've devoted our research and testing program to doing just that. We've identified our 4 key design areas, and those areas are reengineering address canvassing, optimizing self-response, utilizing administrative records, and reengineering field operations. If designed and implemented correctly, we estimate that we could save over $5 billion in savings. As Burton mentioned, we plan to announce our 2020 preliminary design decision by September of 2015. And in order to do so, we've put together what we call the path document. This is going to help guide us through fiscal year 15 to the point in which we make our announcement. There are a few key topics contained within this document. Those include the assumptions that we use to generate our preliminary life cycle cost estimates, the design options and/or components related to each of our 4 design areas. Using administrative records is the design area that has concrete options, A, B, or C. Our other design areas have components. We'll either do A and C, A, B, and C, a subset of all of them. The document also contains our key questions. What do we need to ask and answer prior to September of 2015? It contains a schedule of our key milestones and how we're going to reach out to our stakeholders, such as yourselves. And finally, it outlines our key stakeholders. Next, I'm going to step through each of our 4 key design areas and the topics that are included within the formal document. I do have a copy of that document. If you're interested, I can share that with you after the presentation today. I'm going to move quickly. This presentation normally lasts an hour, but you've already heard from our 2014 team. You're going to hear from Tim and Pat and Mike about address canvassing, and then you'll hear about 2015. So I'm going to focus on the highlights today. Let's start with reengineering address canvassing. The design goal here is to eliminate a nationwide in-field address canvassing. When I say that, I mean we're still going to do address canvassing across the nation, but now a large portion of that will happen in the office. A very small portion will happen in the field, as we've traditionally done in the past. What were the assumptions that we made in relation to reengineering address canvassing when we developed our life cycle cost estimates? I'm going to highlight just 2. First, that we would in-field canvass only 20% of the total housing units. And second, that we would eliminate the early local census offices of the past, that we'd manage our address canvassing operation out of the regional census centers. If we do this, we estimate we can save $1 billion in savings related to address canvassing. Within this design area, there are 5 key components. The first is that we'll remove geographic areas from the in-field address canvassing workload based on the availability of administrative data sets, such as those related to military lands or national forests. And also that we'll allow the method of enumeration planned for 2020 to help us guide our decisions. In the past, we've conducted operations like update leave, update enumerate. Why will we go out twice if we only have to go out once? Let's consider that as we make our plans. The second design component is to use statistical modeling to help determine where to conduct in-field address canvassing. You'll hear more about this as we progress today. The third design component is to use empirical geographic evidence to determine where to conduct in-field address canvassing, such as the use of imagery. The fourth design component is to detect and capture change from administrative and third-party data sources, such as the files that we use from the United States Postal Service, from our state, local, and government partners, and from commercial entities. And fifth, and you'll hear a lot more about this from Mike and Pat this afternoon, is to conduct an in-field partial block canvassing as opposed to full block canvassing. And what does that mean? Instead of walking around a full city block and listing every housing unit, perhaps we'll just list a segment of that block where we know change is occurring and updates are needed. This is a diagram to show that we do in fact plan to split the operation into in-office and in-field work. But in the end, all updates will serve to enhance the quality and the completeness of the master address file. And so what are the key questions that we need to ask as we reach our design decision in 2015 related to address canvassing? First, which address and spatial data, including imagery, can we use to improve the quality of the MathTiger system? Is it federal government data? Is it state, local, tribal data? What about third-party data? Or perhaps, and most likely, it's a combination of all of those approaches. We talked about this. Which geographic areas can we remove from the workload based on the presence of administrative records or specific characteristics? What's the best way to measure the quality and completeness of the master address file? Right now, we're looking at a number of different methods. The MAF error model and the targeted address canvassing model, both of those use auxiliary data to help predict where adds, changes are occurring and to determine where we should or should not conduct in-field address canvassing. The Geography Division has developed quality indicators to tell us about the state of the master address file and Tiger system. We are reinstating our national estimate of coverage to compare what's actually in the map to what our Population Division is estimating occurring in relation to housing units. We're considering the use of an address range check where we send enumerators out into the field, perhaps as part of our American Community Survey, to validate the address in relation to the range along a street segment. Does 3 Main Street fall within 1 to 99 Main Street? Finally, we could consider using a combination of all of those approaches. The next question, and a big question, is can statistical modeling be used to predict stability and change? Which data contributes to the models, and which model performs best? The math error model, the TAC model, a combination of both. You'll hear more about this today. And finally, in relation to address canvassing, how should statistical modeling be used? Should it be used as a direct mechanism to tell us where to conduct in-field address canvassing, or should it be used as an input to help direct our in-office and our field work? Within each of the 4 key design components, I've included a copy of this table to show where we're planning to test and research our efforts. Address canvassing is going to be tested in a few areas. We're conducting the math model validation test right now. We are working in conjunction with our geography division on the Geographic Support System Initiative. We're doing modeling within the Decennial Directorate, and we're including the use of the American Community Survey data. Let's move now to optimizing self-response. And the design goal here is to communicate the importance of the 2020 census to the population and generate the largest possible self-response, eliminating the need to go out and follow up with those housing units in a non-response follow-up workload. What are the assumptions we've made here? First, that the response rate via the internet will be 55%. We are using the internet, it's a go, and the 2014 census test was a great testament that this is possible. The other key assumption was that we recognize that we will have to incorporate the use of paper questionnaires in some areas, and very likely in up to 20% of the areas. But this time around, we'll make more data-driven decisions to help direct where the paper is sent. Planned and implemented correctly, we estimate $548 million in savings related to this category. And there are 2 key design components. Mike talked about both of them when he covered the 2014 results. First, employ the use of a pre-registration phase or a notify me phase. Should we continue doing that as we move forward toward 2020? And second, what we refer to around the Census Bureau as non-ID, allowing people to respond to the census without the use of a unique identification code. There are 2 key options within this category. First, are we going to conduct matching and geocoding in a real-time environment? Are we going to ask the respondent as they respond to update more information if we can't conduct an actual match at that time? The second is perhaps it may be better to conduct our matching and geocoding at the end of the night or 3 or 4 times during the day in a batch mode. Those are things we're looking at now. This is an example from our 24 census test online showing where we did allow respondents to enter their address and street name without entering the unique ID. And what are the key questions that we need to ask and answer in relation to optimizing self-response? First and foremost, what are the best methods for communicating the importance of the 2020 census to the population? We plan to do this through the use of a communications campaign and also through a partnership program. What is the estimated self-response rate? We learned from the 2014 test that 65% of the population responded via self-response, 55% via the internet. What response rate can we expect via different modes, such as telephone and paper? What infrastructure is necessary in order to support the use of the internet and our other modes of contact? How do we consider security, and how do we consider scalability? And then, is there value in asking households to pre-register? Finally, the non-ID question. Should we allow respondents to enter their address without an ID? And I think the answer we found is yes, we should. We're doing a lot of testing in relation to this category. We tested in the 2012 test, the 2014 test. You'll hear this afternoon about our plans for the 2015 test. And then we have a national content and self-response test we're planning for later on. Again, you'll see across the board we're incorporating the use of not only our data from the American Community Survey, but our experiences and our lessons learned. Let's talk now about using administrative records. The design goal here is to use data that the public has already provided to help reduce the non-response follow-up workload. I think the major assumption here is that through the removal of vacant and deleted housing units, we'll be able to reduce the non-response follow-up workload by 11%, thereby reducing the number of local census offices required by 12%. Here we estimate $1.23 billion in savings, another big category. And as I mentioned earlier, we have three concrete options that we're considering here. The first option is simply to match administrative records, such as data from the IRS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Social Security, the Postal Service, to our non-response follow-up workload, and to remove the vacant and deleted housing units. If you've heard some of our math stats speak in the past, in 2010, we had 50 million housing units in the non-response follow-up workload. 14 million of those were actually vacant units, and 5 million were deleted units, those that don't meet our definition of a housing unit. And so you can imagine what an impact that would have if we could remove those from the NRFU workload. Each option has a diagram. You can look at that at your leisure. The second option is to not only match administrative records to the NRFU universe and remove those vacant and deleted housing units, but also to use administrative records to identify those units that are occupied, and to go to those housing units only once. If we don't receive a response on the first visit, we'll use administrative records to fill the response. This is sometimes referred to as the hybrid approach. And in 2014, we were able to remove 32% of the workload using this approach. Design option 3 is to match administrative records to the NRFU universe, to remove those vacant and deleted housing units, to identify the occupied units, and then to conduct no non-response follow-up visits, to simply use administrative records to fill the response. This is sometimes referred to as our full approach. In 2014, we removed 62% of the NRFU workload using this approach. Let's see. Chuck, I'm not moving forward here. Okay, so as Chuck sets up, I'm going to move into the key questions. The first question is very important, and I think you'll also feel that way. Which administrative records are necessary to support the 2020 census? Just like the geography question, are we going to use federal government data, tribal, state, and local government data, third-party data, or a combination of the above? And most likely, it'll be a combination of the above. We do need to remember that this is a national program, though. Does the Census Bureau already have access to the data, or is the data acquisition required? And are we in alignment with our existing memorandums of understanding, agreement with those agencies in which we're sharing our data? Let's see here. How accurately does the Census Bureau remove occupied and vacant units from the non-response follow-up workload? We learned about that in 2013. We'll learn more as we conduct our evaluation as part of 14. And this is an important question too. Is there enough characteristic data to enumerate the people in the household? So we have a few questions on the census, but can we fill in name, sex, age, Hispanic origin, and race using the administrative data? We're studying that now. What about proxy responses? Are they more or less accurate than the use of administrative records? And are they more valuable in certain geographic areas than others? I've traditionally lived in cities. I can tell you when I lived in New York, I didn't know my neighbors on either side of my door. But if I went to my mother's house, I could still tell you everything about every person on the block. And then finally, what is the public's perception of the Census Bureau's use of administrative data? That too is an important consideration, and as Burton mentioned earlier, we do have a risk related to the external perception of administrative records. We've tested this concept as part of the 2013 test, the 2014 test. We'll do it again in 2015. We're conducting a lot of modeling. We've analyzed the results of a Gallup poll related to the public's perception of admin records, and again, the American Community Survey. Okay, let's now talk about re-engineering field operations. The design goal here is to use technology to more efficiently and effectively manage our 2020 census fieldwork. In other words, use automation to help manage tasks and make decisions that have typically been made by humans. And you heard Eli talk a lot about that this morning. This category is a little different because in the other design components, we're still determining the what. For this category, we know the what. Now we're trying to figure out how, and we're putting that into play during our tests. Here it was hard to pull out a few key assumptions. I'm just going to highlight 3. First, that by re-engineering our field operations, we'd be able to increase our NRFU productivity by 20% by using automation. Second, that we would be able to remove those late responses from the NRFU workload and hopefully do it in real time. And third, that we'll reduce our person and phone visits during the contact cycle from 6 to 3 relative to what we did in 2010. This is our biggest cost savings, $2.3 million, if we plan and implement re-engineering field operations. And we have 2 key design components here. First, let's re-engineer the field work. Provide our enumerators with daily, optimal, and sequenced contact attempts. Technology is so much better now than it was in the past. Let's take advantage of it and use it to our best ability. Let's provide our supervisors with electronic access to the workload and what's happening in the field. And finally, let's automate training. Instead of having people come to a local community center, a church basement, pass out pamphlets and stacks of paper and read verbatim, let's have them take the training online. I think we're finding through our requirements within the government that sometimes it's easier to learn about Title 13 on the computer and make that happen than going and sitting in a classroom. And design component 2 is to re-engineer the field staff structure. Let's take a good look at the roles of our field staff. What works best in terms of schedule? Maybe the regimented 8 to 5 of the past, 8 to 4, it's not going to work. Let's see how we can interact with our field staff to implement the best schedules. And finally, what are the appropriate staffing ratios between enumerators, crew leaders, and supervisors? A few key questions here that we need to ask and answer. How can we reduce the cost of field operations with automation? We're learning a lot as part of our field tests. What does the model entail? We really took a good look at what we did in 2010, what we needed to change for 2020, and how we could make that happen using automation. I think Compass was a perfect testament to how we could really use automation to our benefit. And that ties into the next question. What type of systems and devices will be used to support our case assignment, our operational control system, routing and navigation? Which type of GIS system will we use? Geographic information system. How will we best collect data? Will Compass be the enumeration instrument we move forward with? And finally, how do we automate payroll? Something in the past that has really taken up a lot of our time and energy, filling out those paper forms, meeting our crew leader at the McDonald's, and having all that processed. The next question is, will the Census Bureau build or buy these systems? And how will employees obtain the devices? Will it be bring your own? Will it be a contract, et cetera? We're planning to do a lot of testing as part of the 2015 test here. We are also doing simulations in the office and working with people at home how does this work in a simulated environment. And finally, a little bit about the schedule. I'd just like to share with you that this has been an iterative process. In putting together the path for the 2020 Census Design Decision, we reached out to just about every single 2020 program lead there is. On a series of 5 consecutive Tuesdays, we presented this set of design components to our managers, got their buy-in, got their feedback, incorporated it within the presentation. We presented this to decennial leadership in July, to our executive leadership in August. We had a briefing for ESA early September, and now we're briefing you all today. Within the formal document, there is a schedule for continual update on our progress as we learn from our tests and as we try to make decisions related to the announcement of the design in September of 2015. Our plan is that by July of 2015, we will provide John and Nancy with a formal document, a draft, and that we can finalize that by September, realizing all the way that we have to incorporate our lessons learned as we go. And now I think we decided that I would pass this right off to Tim and that we would handle questions at the end of both of our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. Good morning, everyone. So this is a discussion that's taking a slightly deeper dive into the address canvassing topic. This is really a discussion about the readiness of the address data to support a change in the way that we have traditionally conducted an in-field address canvassing operation in the past, for past censuses. And just to put give a perspective on that, in 2010 we had 140,000 listers who walked every street in the nation to either verify or add or delete or change the address that was part of their list. So we're taking a different look at this. So as you just heard, a re-engineered address canvassing is one of the 4 key design areas for the census. The recommendation is about the readiness of the address data to support the change from our recent census experiences. To support the notion of a re-engineered address canvassing, we began with our Geographic Support System initiative to continuously update the address frame, to learn how we could improve on the quality of the data, how to implement improvements in data management. So those things were factors that we focused on. This recommendation is based on work on acquiring and processing data from state, local, and tribal governments that led to addresses being added to the frame and an increase in geocoded addresses. We also looked at third-party data to evaluate the potential benefits of that source. A re-engineered address canvassing comprises components that contribute to its success, such as the notion of the office work for addresses that require research, thereby limiting the amount of field work for areas where we have difficult addresses. You heard about design component 1 from Deirdre for removing areas for which that will be used in the field as part of other operations. This recommendation impacts the subsequent census operations like non-ID and the non-response follow-up. Based on the fact that more partners were collecting address data and were willing to share it, as well as the recognition that technology could support process improvements, we were confident that we could contribute to the design of the re-engineered address canvassing. Based on the results that I'll share with you in this presentation, we are developing an implementation plan that has several components that will support a re-engineered address canvassing for the 2020 census. This afternoon, Pat Cantwell and Mike Radcliffe will talk further about the methodological approaches as part of their presentations. I'm going to focus on some aspects of the data that led us to this recommendation. So this is just simply a timeline of key milestones that led to, or that lead us to, the readiness of the address data. An important assumption is that the process of acquiring source data continue right up through the delivery of the address frame for the 2020 census. So just as we are today working toward this goal, this work will continue right through the census process. So this diagram highlights some of the activities that occurred in 2014 and some activities that are planned for 2015. Acquiring addresses and roads from partners continues through the census. Data modeling began and will be tested based on the results of the address validation test that's going to occur later this year. Change detection research will get underway in earnest, and will define the models and methodologies based on continual learning and experience. So this diagram speaks to the sources of addresses, and this is really how we'll begin assessing the country, or we are assessing the country. If you look at the sources of addresses on the left stack, toward the left, we include the use of commercial files for areas that either have no addresses or have substandard addresses. So we'll begin with the partner files, we'll evaluate them, we'll work them through, we'll go through an in-office evaluation. If the data are good, they go right into the MAF Tiger database that you've heard about earlier. If they are not good from the partner files, we'll look at commercial sources to finally decide whether we can still use that. And if not, then we move off into doing more work in an in-office environment and decide whether or not we have to go through to canvassing. This is an example of some of the areas that we want to take a close look at to see whether in fact we need to really spend time in these areas. So the blue on this map is principally federal lands, military installations, national parks. And so in most of these places, either we have special enumeration activities or we don't have people there, we don't have housing there. And if we do have housing there, these are places where we might be able to work closely with our federal counterparts and other agencies to give us a more up-to-date status on what's happening for those particular areas. So this could save us a tremendous amount. Just think about somebody getting an assignment and walking down a lonely road in western Montana. I mean, that's the kind of thing we're trying to avoid. So experience indicates that stability and consistency of addresses are good indicators of fitness for use. The United States Postal Service delivery sequence file is the primary source for most of the areas that we manage our address data for. Partner data from the local, state, and tribal governments is helping us to add addresses and to supplement the DSF in terms of additional information. And then third-party data is pursued when we have a void or we have insufficient information for a particular area of the country. So this chart is a stability index for addresses within a census tract from the periods of 2009 to 2012. A value of 1 indicates that no change, there's no change, which means that the address successfully used that was used in the 2010 census has not changed, and it's highly likely to be successful if we were to use this address today. A value of less than 1 indicates a level of change, and this is where other sources would add to the DSF, or we'd use the DSF as well as other partner files that can supplement the difference. So for example, just looking at the information, if a new housing unit came on board between that time period, that would indicate a change. It's important to know that the delivery sequence file from the Postal Service does not cover the entire country. Rather, it covers only the areas where they deliver mail. I'm going to show you a little map that has areas on the next slide that will show where the DSF generally does not cover. Actually, that's going to be in this, here we go. So the light blue areas indicate less stability, the darker areas indicate greater stability, and the gray area itself are the areas where you don't see Postal Service coverage. And obviously you can't see too well on this one, but at any rate you would see it on the maps that we provide. Okay, so thus far, we've acquired addresses from partners for about a third of the country, about a third of the census tracts in terms of where population are. That equates to a third of the housing units and a third of the address list. Matches to the MAF help us to validate existing MAF records that we have in the master address file, including where geocodes are unchanged. So you heard Mike describe earlier this morning about the importance of geocodes and what happens if we don't have a good geocode. Partner data has helped to increase geocoding through the new address information that they've provided and resolution of deficient addresses that we could not previously geocode. Lastly, and most importantly, we added addresses that we did not have on the map from other sources like the delivery sequence file. So I just want to point out a couple of numbers here. So we had 30 million addresses submitted by the partner files for the third of the country. 23 million of those matched to the MAF. And of that number, that was 76% of the total for that area, but 97% of those had good geocodes. But the good news is that we actually were able to update and improve a geocode for 1%. So 1% in our language, obviously because we're talking about nationwide efforts, is a big number. And 1.3%, we were actually able to add new geocodes. So I think those are good results as we move forward. State partners result in, for us, if we have state partners at state levels, they are much greater efficiencies for processing data. Each file is different that we receive from whoever the partner is, and so that requires many steps to evaluate and extract the data. Once we process a file, we know basically at that point how to manage that data on subsequent updates throughout the decade. So obviously we'll not be going out to these folks only once. We'll be going out to them periodically to get more updates. For this program, we have been able to get 11 state partners, and that's the best we've ever been able to do with this kind of data. So we're seeing a change in the states, but we will never get 50 states worth of data from the states. 11 states is better than dealing with 40,000 governments, or 50 states is better than dealing with 40,000 governments. But nonetheless, our goal is to try to minimize this to the greatest extent possible. We'll determine in this next year where we believe we will not get data and develop data acquisition strategies for those areas. And just along those lines, recently we spoke to both groups, the National States Geographic Information Council, these are the state GIOs, and our Federal State Cooperative Program on Population Estimates, these are our state demographers. And we've reached out to them and told them that we want them to help us develop this inventory as we go forward. So regarding geocoding, I want to draw your attention to, in this case, the 327,000 addresses that were geocoded from partners thus far. And if you look at the ungeocoded MAF addresses we had for particular areas for the partner data, that adds up to 21% of the total ungeocoded addresses for that partner area. That's significant for us, so that means that's good data coming in. When you add this number to the number of new addresses that we have just added, the 391,000, we end up with 391,000 addresses that will now be in the 2020 census that may not have been there before. So this continual improvement, I think, is helpful as we go forward. Okay. So I'm stuck, I think. So I'll move on to the next one. So for what we have seen thus far on third-party data, it holds promise for us for validating what we have. We have received very few instances of new addresses in that data from this source. And one of the observations we're making is that what I'll call their data hygiene is not the best. It's a little bit dirty and it's a little bit messy. And so that's something that is going to require some additional work on our part. This is an example that's on the screen right now of data sources, and so it includes both imagery and Tiger data, or MAF Tiger data, and we're also using GIS tools that Deirdre referenced a minute ago, and we're using that as part of our in-office review. You'll see more examples like this in Mike and Pat's presentation this afternoon, but it's helping us to understand what we have and what we need. So as a result of the efforts to evaluate and address information, to evaluate and improve address information and to pursue the re-engineered address canvassing, the following recommendations were made. Reduce field work for the 2020 address canvassing. Continue partnership efforts to acquire address data. Use imagery as part of change detection. Identify areas lacking partner data and identify other potential sources. Continue developing measures of certainty about the quality and completeness of the addresses. And then to continue to develop tools to assist our partners that are providing information to us in address data management. We're currently in the field where we're conducting the address validation test that you'll hear about in the next presentation this afternoon. The results of this test are essential for testing our assumptions about the stability and the coverage of the address data, so we're looking forward to those results. As we've stated, based on what we've been learning now, we will formulate an implementation plan for a re-engineered address canvassing operation as part of our activities for this year. Thank you.
So let's open it up for discussion on both of these presentations. Mark?
There were some cost savings goals that were presented in there. Can you discuss a little bit about the basis for those and how they were constructed?
Yeah, we have been working with the development of our cost model for a while. In the fall and winter of last year, we're using the Monte Carlo simulation process to explore an array of assumptions across the entire program and to adjust those assumptions based on data that we have, based on subject matter expertise, to understand relative to the repeat of the cost of or repeating the 2010 census design in 2020 and what that would cost, what do the assumptions that are built into these areas of change that we talk about, the 4 areas of change that we talk about, what do those assumptions arrive at in terms of an understanding of what the potential cost savings are related to that. So we have 83 assumptions in our cost model, and we place a range around each of those assumptions as to what the cost would be under repeating the 2010 census design or the application of the innovations that are under development in order to arrive at those figures.
So
Does that answer your question?
this represents kind of the top level of what your target right now is.
Yes, it is. It's a stretch goal, but it does represent, I think, the most ambitious changes that we would implement, as Deirdre outlined, and what we arrive at in terms of the cost savings if we are successful in developing and implementing the assumptions, the innovations that we have under development right now.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Shannon? Shannon?
Good morning. Shannon
Good morning.
O'Neill, GAO. The path document, or at least the presentation of it, is great. All the key questions, it's great to have that all laid out there. What I'm not certain of is how those 4 key areas and these questions relate to the original 40 some odd R&T projects. If you could just talk about that, that'd be helpful.
Sure. Part of my mission in pulling together this path was really to synthesize all of the research and testing plans that were already out there and to summarize it in a fashion that we could communicate with people like yourselves. We did a close analysis as to how these questions compared to the research and testing plans. Where we added questions as we learned more as part of this process, we went back and we updated the study plans to ensure that we're covering all our bases.
Just one follow-up. So So have any of the projects, I mean, I think there were a couple that were at least halted from earlier budget results, but are any of the other projects being halted as a part of the development of this path document in terms of some priority decisions that were made?
Burton, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, not really. I think that one of the things that Deirdre did was hone in on, as we have in the whole program, hone in on where work needs to be done directly related to the cost savings to get to those key design decisions to ensure that we're on track to meeting our obligation to holding the cost to the cost of the 2010 census by housing unit when adjusted for inflation. But there's a lot of work that the research teams are doing that go well beyond that, around quality, around other elements of change in the program, around refinements to the census design. And that work has not been halted. And it's not, Deirdre's document is not an overview of the entire work that's going on with relation to the census, the 2020 census. It really hones in on those areas related to cost.
And just to follow up for just a second, also, as we stood up additional teams, some of those existing teams were rescoped. So for example, as we recognized the need to put earlier attention around our OCS or our rocket effort, that team took on particular responsibilities. And some of the existing teams where that scope might have been interrelated, it was moved from one to the other. So we did that assessment as well.
We've also, over the past years, we've really identified the key areas where we need to be focused on. We've built up some teams. I mean, the Rocket is an example of that. Non-ID processing is an example of that. The reengineering of address canvassing and building in change detection is a reflection of that. The added addition of communications work in the Savannah site is a indication of really understanding better what are the huge priorities, the significant priorities for the program that we need to be honed in on. Again, though, there's a lot of work that is going on around these areas and in areas that go across the full gamut of census operations. Others? Ty? Then Trish?
Yeah, thanks. This is great to see this path. I know it comes up at a bunch of PMRs in the past, having this together, and it's great that you've got one here. Thanks for sharing this. Three questions, I think. One, on the path itself, the key questions, do you see a role in this document or when you deliver things in the fall next year to John and on Upline and whatnot, to see within some of those key questions, like the cost across some of those designs? I mean, I know you're focused on the cost savings, but when you get to actually deciding across those designs, is that not a part of, where does that fit in?
It is a big part of our decisions moving forward. We talked about the preliminary life cycle cost estimates. We used the Monte Carlo simulation estimation method there. We'll rerun those estimates prior to February, the presidential budget submission, and then we will rerun them prior to September when we announce the design decision to see how what we're deciding impacts cost. We're also doing a large deal of work with quality, and especially the cost-quality trade-offs. We have developed a micro simulator that has been demoed several times in-house, and I believe will be demoed soon for all of you, to help us do a full analysis of the quality of the data as we're moving forward.
And the Monte Carlos and whatnot, you have the granularity to distinguish across the different design options you're looking at with that. So when you rerun them, you'll you'll adjust all the parameters to the designs that you're proposing, the options, right? I mean, that's good.
Correct.
Good, excellent. If I can ask on administrative records, is there one document in one place that lists all of the sources the Bureau has already resolved or is researching or would like to research, with a bunch of columns that say things like, we're authorized to use this for research only, we're authorized to use this for evaluation, we're authorized to use this for imputation versus, just removing somebody from NRFU versus actually using the characteristic, and then all the way across and even down to whether we think we're authorized and then whether we actually have an MOA and we know we can use it. Just so you have a sense of when you're testing in 2015, if you're testing something that you can probably do or you're testing something that requires an immense amount of work to negotiate.
Yes. In my role as Senior Advisor for Administrative Records, I was hired to do that position in May. I have compiled a document, it's a working document, that lists all of the sources that we have used in the past, for example, as part of the 2010 Census Match Study, and all of the sources we've looked at for the 2013 test, the 2014 test, what we're considering for 15, what we're doing in our other areas of the Census Bureau, such as our Center for Administrative Records and Research Application. As part of that spreadsheet, I do have columns related to whether or not we have an existing memorandum of understanding, agreement, if it's an interagency agreement, if whether I believe what we're doing now is in line with that agreement, perhaps we need to make some changes. A good example is our work with the Internal Revenue Service. We just had a meeting with them at the end of September to say this is the MOA that we have in place. These are the predominant purpose statements that we have in relation to each of our projects where we're using the federal tax information. Do you agree that we're in line with that predominant purpose statement? Yes. There were a few that we needed to renew, and so we're working on that. But yes, that is part of my responsibility to make sure that we're adhering to those agreements, that we're corresponding with our other federal and state agencies.
We'll ask you for a copy later.
Okay.
Third question related to, back to reengineering the ad can. Hold on, wrong page. I tried to write this up. Okay, I'm slide 7, Tim, on that, you had that wonderful picture, kind of like mapping out kind of a decision tree a little bit on, you know, how these different things fit together. I know this has to be a simplification, it's a model, has to simplify reality, but I'm looking at like the top rhombus on the left and the bottom rhombus on the left, where you're either looking at the partner files or the commercial files. That's it. Yep, wait, there it is, that's on the screen. Is it, what do you do if, I mean, would you go from that top rhombus, if you had a no from a partner file, a local partner file, directly to the right if you had commercial sources that covered that same geography? Because according to this picture, I don't see like kind of that iterative decision-making, like what if I got a commercial source that does it instead? It looks like you would just automatically go right over to the right, even if down below you might have had a commercial source covering that geography.
Right, so one of the things that we'll do, first of all, this is a very simplified version.
Correct,
But one of the things we do get is a regular update to the delivery sequence file from the Postal Service. So that's a good source for us. So we're constantly checking that, so that's one activity that we're doing. We believe that because the partners are basically providing the Postal Service with their data, that's why we put them at a fairly high level. And we've seen that they are fairly authoritative in what they do. So they're providing their information to the Postal Service in general. That's where the Postal Service doesn't make up the addresses, they get them from the local governments. If we end up in a situation where we have a void or we don't have information, at that point then we're going to be going to the third-party data to see if we can fill that void, and if so, then we'll evaluate that data in the same way. If not, then we'll have to go to some other source, and some other source might be that in this case we look to imagery to see if we can locate the information, and if not, at the end of the day, that might make its way right into the field address canvassing if we can't resolve that in an in-office situation. So as we said earlier in the earlier presentations, there are going to be places where we're sending paper questionnaires. Well, there are also going to be places where we're going to have to do some address canvassing.
Stuart?
Hi. On the admin records, and apropos of what you were just mentioning, have you looked at whether some records in certain situations, some sources would always be considered a more reliable source than another record? Because you were saying before that when the records were in conflict, you simply, just said, okay, they're in conflict and we can't use anything. So, has there been a hierarchy, established by looking at the records saying, okay, postal office records are more up to date than anybody else's records, therefore we'll use that information even if it's in conflict with some other source?
As Eli mentioned earlier, the files that we're looking at now for the 2013 test, the 14 test, consists of the Internal Revenue Service file, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services file, the United States Postal Service undeliverable as addressed, and then the Social Security's Numident file. Those are the data sources that are nationwide right now, that areas that support our tests. We will evaluate which each of those contributes to the quality of the data. How often are we able to fill name, sex, age? The Fitness for Use team that was placed on hiatus last year is back in business now, and they're looking specifically at Hispanic origin and race. And then we're also looking at different types of sources, such as commercial sources, to help support the housing unit questions, occupancy and tenure.
Okay, so you're going back and getting a sense of which records are more reliable in which situations, or which fields of data are more reliable from which sources?
Correct.
Good. On the cost issue, it's slightly out of my league, so I don't want to step on it. It may have been decided already. Inevitably, there's institutional pressures that cause decisions not to occur as timely as you wish they were. have in your cost model? Are you ready sort of trying to develop scenarios to say, well, if this decision gets delayed by X number of months, this is what it's going to cost us? I mean, I know it's a very tricky thing, but if you have all that.
It is a tricky thing. I think it's not so much in the cost model where we're doing that. It's in the risk register where we're doing that, where we're looking at various risks that the program faces and what the cost and quality trade-offs are if those risks are realized. So, we have a risk that we might not be able to use administrative records. We need to quantify that. And we need to quantify that based on what it means if that decision is made earlier or later in the decade. And I think that's where we're trying to get a much stronger understanding of what it means to make late changes to the program, to make changes to the program as we're moving forward.
Thank you.
Sure. Carol?
Thank you. So most of this isn't a surprise to me, so I'm happy about that. But the one thing that did sort of surprise me the first time I've seen this was reducing the number of local census offices by 5%. So in 2010, you had 494. You're looking to reduce 25? And I guess the other thing, the RCCs weren't mentioned in here, and you had 12 in 2010?
Right.
Or is
We're
there any
likely to
plan
have
to
6
reduce?
in
Okay.
2020. I think that there's an iterative process in looking at the reductions of LCOs across a number of the different innovations, and I think that those build on themselves, so it's really much higher than that. Did you want to add to that, or is that accurate?
For each of the key categories, so for reengineering address canvassing, for example, how many LCOs could we reduce if we employ the use of in-field canvassing only? That was one assumption. We had a very similar assumption related to using automation as part of our field operations. Those built upon one another, and I'm not the budget person, but my understanding is that right now our model integrates all of those, and moving forward we're going to be pulling those out, as Ty asked, by category.
So let me speak to that in a little bit of a different way. The numbers that you're seeing in the path document, a lot of the assumptions that are there are the assumptions or the parameters that Burton was referring to when we produced our preliminary life cycle cost estimate. As part of the effort that you'll hear this afternoon, and a little bit of what Deirdre talked about this morning, in our field reengineering area, one of the things that we're actively looking at is how we will change those management ratios, how we will change those staffing ratios, and what the impact of those changes will be on the footprint and that we will have in the nation. And we're still working through that. We're testing one scenario in 15, and we'll see how that test goes. It'll have new technology, it'll have new staffing ratios, but not to steal some of Stephanie's thunder, and you may have already heard this. For example, one of the things that we're testing in that 15 test is we are removing one layer of management completely from that process. Will the number of LCOs be smaller? Yes, I think that's very likely. We have a team, in addition to Rocket, that's actively working on what that is, and I know they've just engaged this week, I believe, with the RDs for some of that discussion. You also referenced the RCCs. We're still having discussions with our field directorate about how many RCCs we will have for the 2020 census, but we need to keep in mind, different from 2010, that we have re-engineered and changed our field infrastructure, and it's very likely that what we did in the past won't be the same as what we did in the future, because it needs to be somewhat consistent for us. But those are the very questions that we're working through now, where we'll have more concrete information in our September design decision.
So just to clarify, the reducing the total number of LCOs by 5%, so it could be more than that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Other questions? Trish?
I have a comment. What's really exciting to me about what you're doing, and I just want to make sure it's a little bit highlighted here, is moving into using technology, which has come a long way, and since the last decennial and will continue, that you're moving into a real-time environment where management's going to be more real-time, and the use of administrative records on a real-time basis. That's really very interesting. And also, okay, so I have one question. I can't resist for a question for geography. a lot of the activities are the same. You know, you still have to do LUCA. There was an in-office, remember, Carol? There was in-office field, field review, field quality review, MAFGOR, is that right? Yeah, it's last decade, and it didn't really flourish. But clearly, the cost savings would be, be impacted by more in-office. So what is different this decade? Technology is different. How is it going to help? Do you still have the people doing the work? Because I really do feel the quality of the addresses and the maps are so essential to the efficiency of the field operations. So how do you see a qualitative difference here?
So the first thing is I'm very happy to answer your questions about geography. I think it's a combination of things. So one of the things that's happening, I mean, first of all, we're a data gatherer. We don't generally create our own data. We have some data we create ourselves in a geography context, like we delineate statistical areas for dissemination of the data at the end of the census. But generally speaking, we're using other people's stuff. And so we're getting addresses from the Postal Service or from local governments. We're getting road data from the local governments. We're getting that information from them, and we're putting it together. One of the reasons why we have spent so much time in the past trying to make that better is that it comes to us in all different forms and shapes and sizes and quality, and we try to make the most of it. One of the things that we're observing is that with the increased use of geospatial data as a whole, and just talk about that in general, we're seeing much higher quality data coming from those other sources. So that's making our job a little bit easier. Secondly, they are following standards that do exist for that industry, and we help generate those standards. For example, the Bureau is responsible for address standards, and so we manage that ourselves. So we're seeing that helps in that process. And then the other side of it is that the tools are becoming so much more capable and easier to use. So that's also helping us do our work. I would say in general, though, the first thing that we apply to any task that we have is to automate as much as we possibly can, because the volume of data and the differences in the data and the characteristics of the data are just so much that it's in our best interest to try to do things in an automated way as much as possible. And so we do that. We set up systems that allow us to process the data. So when you're talking about, for example, matching addresses coming in from whatever source for whatever purpose, we have honed the matching software to a point where I don't know anybody that matches better than us. And so how do you match data? I was listening to a presentation from the GIO from the state of Colorado, and he said, I went into this process thinking that, we're just talking about data structures, that seems pretty simple. We're just talking about address data, that seems pretty simple. And then he started looking at the data, and he got addresses shoved, all the information shoved into a single field in the file. Well, you can't do anything with that. I mean, that's not usable. So you have to break that out and put it into different records in different fields so that you can actually go through a process of address standardization, for example. We developed the code to be able to do that in a meaningful way. So I think we've got tools that are in place. I think we're getting better data. We're getting better coverage of the data. So I think in general the nature of the work is probably not changing as much, and that was your lead-off question really. There's still the same work that has to be done. I mean, we're talking about the quality of the data. That's what we're focusing on, and the coverage of the data. So if we can assure that we have good coverage and we can assure that we have good quality of the data, then it makes the use and the subsequent processes that use that data much more efficient. If we start out with bad data, we're going to have bad results in subsequent operations. There's no question about that. We've had that experience in the past. That's been the case. So.
Thanks.
Carol.
Tim, can I clarify, when you say 20% reduction, you're talking about all addresses, not just mail out, mail back areas?
So I think you're referring to the number that Deirdre used. Is that correct? So that's a number that's 20% of the country, of the addresses, 20% of the addresses that we would canvass. That's what that's based on. We're still working to see what those numbers look like, because that's obviously an estimate. We don't have full coverage yet in terms of all of the address information. Remember, I mentioned that we've brought in a third of the country, a third of the addresses for the nation. So we're looking at that data to measure what that looks like. And it's in and around that 20%, so that's kind of where we are at the moment.
Others? All right, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but why don't we go ahead and break for lunch and come back at 1:35? 12:35. Not 1:35, 12:35. 1 hour for lunch, not 2 hours for lunch.